Welcome to Day 97 on the Trail. We have 4 readings for today from Romans chapter 1 verses 1 through 32, Numbers chapter 4 verses 1 through 49, the 92nd Psalm, and Judith chapter 4 verses 1 through 15. Today, we begin our exploration of Paul's letter to the church in Rome. This is one of Paul's most influential and powerful letters, and we could spend weeks studying the book of Romans. However, for the purposes of the trail, we will be focusing on some of the central themes of the letter, and I hope provide insights that might help you when you have more time to dig into this foundational letter of Paul. Now, regarding the letter itself, Romans does not seem to address any specific problems in the church in Rome, as we saw with his letter to the church at Colossae. Instead, it appears that Romans is a letter of introduction, as we saw with Philemon on day 95. In the case of Romans, we learn in chapter 15 that Paul has plans to visit Spain. Therefore, it is believed that Paul is sending this letter, along with Phoebe, Paul's benefactor and deaconess at the church at Cenchreae, to introduce himself and what he teaches about Jesus to the church at Rome. Therefore, in Romans, we are provided with a concise summary of what Paul believed and the core principles that he taught. Here, in this one document, we have a look at Paul's teachings and a view into what he most wanted to impress upon others regarding his faith and love for Christ. Yet, this is also a personal letter. Paul is speaking of his experiences with the living Jesus and the consequences that Jesus has in our daily lives. Before we look at chapter 1, I have provided a brief outline of Romans to provide us a roadmap of where we are heading. Paul opens with a greeting, which is common for Paul, followed by a thanksgiving, which is also expected. But then we have a thesis in verses 16 and 17 of chapter 1. This is unique. This is a summary statement, or even a mission statement for Paul in the book of Romans. Of Paul's 13 letters in the New Testament, this is the only one that has a distinct thesis statement. And then we have the body of the letter in chapter 1, verse 18 through 15. This expands on the meaning of his thesis. This is set in the form of a scholastic diatribe. This was a rhetorical style from the ancient Greco-Roman philosophical traditions. This involved the use of questions, objections, rebuttals, and direct address to explore ideas, challenge assumptions, and develop arguments. For example, in Romans, we have an antithesis. Why Paul's thesis actually matters, where his argument starts. And then he restates his thesis and expands on it. And this will help us explain what Paul means in his thesis statement in verses 16 and 17 of chapter 1. And then he gives some examples, some evidence by experience, some comparisons. He takes objections, and so on. So again, this is a traditional style of philosophy to develop an argument. After that, Paul then gives his recommendations for Phoebe and his future plans, greetings, and a final prayer. So for today, I would like to focus on Paul's thesis statement, as this is the main theme that will carry us through the rest of Romans. For Paul, this is the core of the Christian faith and its practice. In Romans chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, Paul writes, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For in it, the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith. As it is written, the one who is righteous will live by faith." This is a tightly packed statement, especially for one so important. However, remember that Paul himself will unpack this statement in the body of the letter. Now, when I say this is tightly packed writing, let me give you a couple of examples. Consider this phrase. When Paul says, the righteousness of God is revealed, does he mean the righteousness of God, that is, righteousness belonging to God, that God is just, God's inherent righteousness? Or is righteousness of God something that comes from God, that is, God's activity to establish a right relationship with us? Perhaps Paul means both, and is collapsing these two ideas into one concise statement. That is, if we are to be disciples of Christ, followers of Jesus, then our righteousness, how we act, should reflect the righteousness that defines who God is. Now, we will have to wait to learn more about this when Paul expands this in chapter 3. The second statement is even more concise, and therefore has created some difficulty for translators. So Paul says, "For in it the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith." The most literal translation from the Greek would be out of faith to faith. So what does Paul mean here? Well, first, this can be describing the completeness of faith, something like beginning and ending with faith, or thoroughly faithful. Second, this might be interpreted as beginning with God, a gift of God's faithfulness. So out of the faith of God, and leading to our response of faith, that is, to our faith. Third, and perhaps most likely, the righteousness of God is revealed out of the faith of Jesus to the faith of his followers. Again, we will look at how Paul expands on this brief statement in chapter 3 and perhaps gain some additional insight. Now, one last important point from our reading today. Beginning in Romans 1:18, Paul states the reason that this thesis statement is so important, why this central point is desperately needed. Beginning in verse 18, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and wickedness of those who by their wickedness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. Ever since the creation of the world, his eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things he has made. So they are without excuse." Right at the outset, Paul places all of us in the same boat. He levels the playing field. It does not matter who you are or your background. We can all look at the world around us, the created order, and realize that this did not just happen. We are part of the created world. Therefore, we should recognize that there is a creator, and our lives are a gift. And Paul is telling us that what we do with this information is critically important. Do we acknowledge God or not? If you do you allow God, the Creator, to have a rightful claim on your life? This is our first critical choice. How will we respond to our Creator? Then in verse 21 through 23, Paul says, "For though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their senseless minds were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling a mortal human being, or birds, or four-footed animals, or reptiles." Now, what is Paul describing here? Idolatry. Everything flows from this first choice. Either you give thanks to God and honor him, or you do not. Idolatry begins in the refusal to glorify God as God. To reject our dependence on God is to deceive ourselves about the very structure of reality. And as a result, reason and will are damaged. Paul then goes on to describe the consequences of this first decision not to honor or give thanks to God. Verses 24, 26, and 28 all begin with a cause and effect statement. So, starting back in verse 21, for though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him. Then in verse 24, therefore, so because of what happened in verse 21, therefore God gave them up to the lusts of their hearts, to impurity. In verse 26, for this reason, God gave them up to degrading passions. And again in verse 28, since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind, and to do things that should not be done. The rest of the transgressions listed in these sections are in reality the result of the one primary first sin of failing to honor and give thanks to God. When we decide that our lives are not contingent upon God, and we fail to honor God, we suppress the truth, and that leads to progressive deterioration of our very capacity to know the truth. However, Paul has some good news coming in the following chapters. Thank you for joining us today. Until next time, stay on the trail.